So my name is Ilze Geijzendorffer from Alterra, and I'll present this. It's also a kickoff, I think, for the breakout groups. And I think agree that a lot of the questions that people immediately flag has to do with the biggest challenges and people have been facing in their own work and their own networks. And also I think that the inventarization of the failures of yesterday really flags some things that went wrong, and well, we still need to develop in some ways how we want to approach them, or at least advice on them from the NoK project, and that's partly also done in why the breakup groups are there today. So this presentation aims to highlight these challenges that we've seen. They also come from the regional workshops that we've had. We've had 3. And we want to present some solutions, or at least some things that directions we have chosen within the NoK project that we think will yield the best way forward. But obviously this is all open for discussion, and we're really looking for your feedback. And any feedback or suggestions or ideas that come out now, they will be included in this green or white paper, and it is more focused on, what did Barbara say, the rules, roles and rights. And obviously the further development of the NoK prototype. So the purpose of the NoK is really to boost the knowledge flow between knowledge holders and knowledge seekers. And it really seeks to enhance the interface between these two. Barbara just spoke of those. So there's a general principle for the NoK and a few things that pop up which are really important for placing the NoK in its international context, and also to be of interest for knowledge holders and knowledge seekers. So the first one is salience. It has to be relevant to the users, because else no one will go to this NoK to seek knowledge. It has to be independence of influence groups, because else the credibility of the NoK is at stake. Also, the credibility of the assessments that are done and the products are very important, as Cochrane illustrated yesterday as well. In order to prevent some sort of exclusiveness to start, like for instance, this NoK only consults the northern European countries, or it only focuses on terrestrial issues. It really should at least have a perception of inclusiveness, and that is one of the challenges, for instance, to link to all these knowledge holders in the whole landscape. But it covers geography, so countries shouldn't be felt left out, disciplinaries and knowledge systems. Results obviously should be legitimate. It's not one expert that says, I think it is such. It really needs a proper base. And it should be flexible to learn and to adapt, because context will change, policies will change, so it needs to be flexible in order to be relevant and up to date. So these are the points that we think are the main challenges and offer the best opportunities for a NoK. It's the connecting, committing and acknowledging the actors, which is one of the questions that popped up just now often. It's data sharing standards and data exchange. It also came up with the failures of yesterday. The finances has popped up already. Quality assurance. There are already some steps in the prototype now. And how we communicate about the prototype, but also about the work that is done. So, as Carsten just said, it's a network of knowledge. Anyone could be a part of this, or anyone who holds knowledge is a part of this. And it's time to try and see how we can build this network of networks, of existing institutes. They are in networks. But we should also be able to connect to all types of networks, of all types of organizations, consultancies, individuals, universities. And we have to be able to be flexible. New projects emerge. It has to be connected in some way. How are we going to do that? And it has to be attractive for knowledge holders, because else we're not going to get this inclusiveness. If it's not interesting to join or to contribute, then we're missing out on these people. So in one way to get people attracted to either contribute, or to pose questions, or to at least acknowledge the status that this NoK as a neutral entity might have, we're looking for ways of how to establish this. So it could be status, like IUCN yesterday was mentioned. It could be financial. You could be paid to do it, and it could be scientific rewards or credits. So from the regional workshops, a few of these things popped up. So maybe reviews that are made or that are written coming from assignments to the NoK, they might be considered to be scientific peer-reviewed publications. There's a very strict review procedure. And also they might be linked to third-party funds. A lot of our scientists struggle with getting the work done that they want to do, so that they might be rewarded in some way, is another possibility. Research institutions are a different party that should be interested in the work of a NoK and to contribute, and they are very much triggered by the visibility of what they do. So it should be visible that, I know our institute really likes to be visible as Alterra participated in this high-profile document. It triggers my director. And it should also provide a clear added value, right? So it's not a single scientist that does something. No, it has of a wider value. Funders usually do not acknowledge science policy activities as an indicator of quality or excellence. You can put it in your CV and hope they notice it, but it's a different, it could have more status and we could have a better place. But in order to include these kinds of aspects for the NoK, it's a big question of how to tackle these three lines simultaneously. And also yesterday we looked at, for instance, volunteers. Volunteers, it's nice if they become active. For instance, the UK database of yesterday, the birds and butterflies, a lot of volunteers add their data and are willing to contribute. But can it be used? Because we also have to look at the governance and the quality assurance. But it would be really great if we can also include this kind of data and to also be able to use it. So this is a question that still lies for the development of the NoK. How can we make sure that the NoK gets this position and that it is acknowledged by everyone and actually captures this niche? Data came up a few times yesterday as well as a problematic. Interpretation of biodiversity is hampered by lack of harmonization, protocols, common databases. It can result in multiple experts seemingly disagreeing, but maybe they're just using different parameters. And this does not help our communication, and it does not help the credibility of the scientific community that works within the NoK. Harmonization obviously is required for the reporting, as many of you know. And data sharing is often problematic due to either ownership or confidentiality or not yet published. So we have to think of how we can actually work on these topics to make it better and also the data accessible. So just to give some examples of how these differences are actually currently in place. For instance, in marine ecology, data sharing is common practice when it comes to fish stocks and plankton. There's quite a nice database. And there are certain levels of standards and data harmonization so that communication is allowed between institutes on findings. Whereas for freshwater, data are collected for very specific purposes by very specific institutes. And only in very exceptional cases the data is actually accessible or you can access it, publicly available. And for terrestrial ecology, only for some species there are standard protocols. And it's not so that it's always accessible. And if you look at Article 17, then interpretation can still differ between parties and between recorders. So these are just like also the problems within the field, and NoK cannot necessarily solve these, but will struggle with the same problems. So in order to be able to build the credibility for the NoK, its outputs, the work that it's done, we need to at least do some form of harmonization. But harmonization of methods does not mean that we also have to harmonize conclusions. Sorry. That would be weird if different dominant opinions are and we cannot merge them to one outcome that everyone supports. Obviously that would be the best, but in lots of cases this is not the case. It's not possible. So that should not be the purpose of the review processes in the NoK. And the data assessed that we use in the assessments, it should include all countries and experts, because else it's a big flaw also in the outputs, for the outputs of the NoK. But this is quite a challenge on its own. As everyone knows, it's quite difficult for some countries to actually contribute data. I know that the UK often has big problems with spatial data because of locations of farmers that should be kept confidential. So the NoK should actually, when it actually communicates about its the research is done, it should be very clear on which definitions were used. You already notice it here of what we think is a knowledge landscape and whether that means it's limited or that it's open. And also, preferably, we don't want to develop our own new set of standards, but we want to use the most common ones, but show also in relation to other standards which might be used in order to show where we position the outcomes and the research. But there are questions about the NoK which we have not answered yet. For instance, how should we tackle data ownership? Does NoK need an own database? That's quite a different task altogether. For now, we see it more as facilitating and data staying with owners, as long as we can give some sort of quality assurance, but that's difficult on its own. And then who determines definition and data standards? I mean, I'm just saying, oh, we should do like this, but there's a KCB, there are experts in working groups, and then there is reviewers, and then there is a client. So we have to think of some way of getting more strict maybe procedures, like the Cochrane example of yesterday, in order to just at least make the procedure really transparent. Governance is a tricky one. It's very important for the acceptance and the credibility of the NoK. And we say that clear and transparent procedures would actually immediately yield this sort of trust in the governance system. But in fact, we just saw an example, for instance, at EU level for the evaluation of an e-project, which was completely transparent procedure, but the outcome might not necessarily please anyone that was involved. So it does not necessarily mean that very transparent governance yields to results that anyone would be happy with. So we might have to think about this. So if we want to improve the transfer of knowledge, it is easy when there are standards that we can use that everyone understands. For instance, in economy, there are lots of these figures that end up in the newspaper that everyone understands. And if the context and issues are very straightforward, it's also more easily to place whatever findings and its interpretation. But biodiversity issues are often characterized by lack of commonly accepted figures, complex system, and involvement of multiple, sometimes very influential or financially strong sectors. So it's really going to take very careful look at the governance structures to make sure that we will be able to reach that level of trust and credibility and also keep it that way. It's going to be quite a challenge. So just some aspects for which the governance will ask. Transparent procedures, especially for selection of scientists and project leaders. There obviously are already some examples of this in Europe. Transparency of the control procedure. Open involvement of knowledge holders, so no one feels excluded. An active check on potential conflicts of interest. Now, these can be obviously through the funder, but it can also be because of your reviewers. It can be because of your client, and all these have to be at least minimized. And also independence of the NoK is very important, and we see that in the regional workshops there was a lot of voice for this NoK being able to also make a to present agenda setting issues, so not necessarily questions that were asked outside, but more questions that came from inside, because, for instance, of very significant data missing, or because of maybe sectors not wanting this question asked. So it would be good if there's at least some independence to be able to bring these aspects forward as well. So then questions that remain for the NoK, for instance, are where is governance placed within the NoK? Barbara showed the flow throughout the whole prototype. But who should actually be leading this governance and keep a check on it? Because if it's the same party that lobbies for the financing for the NoK, it's going to be very confusing and not very transparent. And it's also a question of how do we maintain the independence of the research there, but also be open for everyone, which also would include a lot of streams of expertise or knowledge that you might not find very desirable for an independent outcome of the project. And who will choose? Who can contribute? Finances is also an important one, obviously, not in the least because of its independency for funders, but also to ensure political neutrality. and also to develop a sound long-term business plan. Obviously, everyone knows the EU funding for projects is very short. It's intense, but it's short, and after that you have to see whether you keep on standing on your own legs. So if we look at several of these policy science interfaces and see if we can learn from how well or how were they financed, what worked well and what did not work so well, we can find that there are three ways that funding might work. The first one is complete funding by one major donor, or a core funding for, let's say, the structure, and then there's project funding coming in additionally. Or there's a bottom-up approach where the institutes and the researchers themselves sort of find the financing for the full requests. So if we look at the complete funding by one major donor, you often see that these bodies then become very much linked to the one big donor. For instance, DG Environment has these institutes that work on specific policies, but they're very much linked then to the DG of Environment. So independence is then quite an issue. Core funding via a fund and then additional financing for specific projects. You could maybe imagine that for at least in the prototype, the knowledge coordination body would be funded long term, and that the questions that come in then finances the additional work you would like to do. But this is not often seen in Europe. At least in Europe, the mainstreams go via the project and not so much on the long-term financing of at least this management part of the prototype, or the projects. And also, if you want to do this, you need to have everyone agreeing upon what this institute organization is going to do. You can see with IPBES, it takes quite long negotiations for everyone to at least agree on the basics. And if some countries, for instance, think that this is not what they stand for, they don't want that, it's very difficult to reach the kind of inclusiveness that is required for the credibility of the NoK. And then there's the bottom-up approach. It sounds more like an idyllic approach. I mean, there's a lot of research institutes that are currently already joining into consortia and work together, but they haven't really been able to actually attract major fundings. So it's not a very likely path towards the future to finance a whole NoK and its framework. So from the regional workshops, we found that there was a strong sense that the KCB at least should have long-term funding, just to ensure that it can do its work, but also to ensure a certain independency of the whole dynamics in politics and all these things. And also, if there is budget, some of this budget should be allocated to actually see if we can make this agenda-setting issue, so that we can actually confirm our neutral status that way. And then it's because of its inclusiveness and its politically neutral status that we're looking for. It should be that all EU countries should contribute in some way, so that everyone feels connected and everyone feels responsible for this organization. So again, some of these questions come up again. I mean, how should the tasks of seeking budget and lobbying be combined with an independent status of the NoK? And what is required to gather funding from all European countries? It's quite a big thing, although obviously IPBES is making steps. And what kind of budget is required at all? I think within KNOW we will look into that, but it's obviously a very important aspect as well. Then quality assurance, IPCC has learned us that it's very important. It's also, we already tackled, I think, a lot of these aspects in our prototype, like clear review procedures. And one of the things that came up from the Millennium Assessment in IPCC is that we can include an indication of level of expert agreement, just to show whether this is the dominant opinion and everyone's already okay, or whether it's actually a topic for debate. And so that's also, I mean, this is an important aspect of the outputs that are given. So just some aspects of the quality assurance, which were also discussed already for the prototype. Accuracy of information, the limitations, how far can we go, alternative options, so this means if the dominant answer is not obvious, then we have to look at the different opinions that are there and what are the trade-offs, and the lifespan of the answer. If you get an answer which only holds until the next elections, let's say, then we need to stasis. So the quality assurance, again, is who should perform this task. And obviously it costs time and money, and we should be able to make ways of how to do it in the most efficient way. And for instance, the data, should it be independently screened, or are we just relying on the experts that contribute? There are different things that we need to think of still. And the last one is communication. So communication is not only how we communicate in a process with, for instance, a client, but it's also how we talk to our knowledge holder group, the landscape. How do we get them continuously interested and willing to contribute, and maybe dispersing also the results? And how do we position the NoK externally to clients? We have to talk about what are the things that we produce, but also these things are going on, you're allowed to participate. So it should be about our public relations. We hope to get some acquisition there to get new projects in. We announced our produced outputs, and we offer the wider landscape for a means by which they can provide input. And it has to demonstrate also the transparency on our governance and quality assurance. One of the questions that came up in the regional workshop is, should all products be open for public? Because obviously they're being paid by a client, but if he's not happy, he or she is not happy with the actual results, should the NoK then actually demand that it's still open for published? It's one of the tricky things. And then communication, which ways are more effective? I personally don't know, but I know that there's a lot of things going on with website, blogs, newsletters. And as we heard yesterday from some success along, a lot of civilians and volunteers get very happy with photos or videos, but it takes quite a lot of financial allocation as well to be able to do that in a good way. So these are things that we need to consider as well. So these are some points that were raised, and I'm hoping that we can make some further steps in the breakout groups on any of these topics. And well, thank you for your attention.